So we are just days away, and you know this now because we've been saying it for weeks, if not months. We are days away from this historic election in South Africa. And throughout the campaign, Africa Check has been fact-checking claims by political parties in their manifestos, and they've just recently released research on how political parties like Action SA, Build One South Africa and Umkhonto weSizwe, among others, have tried to rival the big three on some of the pressing issues. And joining me now is Keegan Leech, a researcher at Africa Check. Keegan, good morning, and thanks as always for your time and for sharing some of the findings that the team has made. I think let's just set the scene with how bombarded South Africans and would-be voters have been with all of these different manifestos and the promises and the undertakings that a number of parties are making, and why it's sometimes difficult to cut through the noise and be able to interrogate and check the promises that they are making or the claims that they are making against fact.
Absolutely. Well, it's often not very difficult to actually dig up the data, but there are so many parties and each of them are making so many different claims about the areas that they are most concerned about. And it takes a lot of time to sift through all of that and check everything rigorously. So we try and take some of the load off of ordinary South Africans by doing that ourselves. With our time and resources so that you don't have to.
And it's interesting because some of the claims made might be completely wrong. Some of them may be misleading in how they choose to frame some of the facts and figures or the concepts that they cite, and others are found to be true. So because we don't have time to go through the entire stack of findings that you've made, we'll just go through a couple. And perhaps we can start with Build One South Africa and Bossa and their claim about South Africa having the highest youth unemployment in the world. How should viewers be listening to that and interpreting it against what they've said, and what were your findings?
Well, if you just look this up, you might find a ranking from someone like the International Labour Organization, which does put South Africa not highest, but second in the world for youth unemployment. But there are a couple of complicating factors here. The first is that those rankings are collected based on countries' own submissions and at slightly different times, and so might all have collected a slightly different category for what constitutes youth or what constitutes employment or something like that. And the other big issue is that there is no standard global definition of youth. The versions of the definition that Stats SA uses are slightly different from some of the versions used by, say, the United Nations. And so it is quite difficult to compare there.
Although, so we use two measures for youth. They fall in the categories 15 to 24 and 25 to 34, and maybe the international conventions just use that first category.
A lot of them do, so that's the one that the UN uses. In South Africa, we typically refer to that group as the NEETs, Youth Not in Education, Employment or Training, and Stats SA uses a slightly broader definition that goes up to the age of 25 to 34 for youth when it uses just that word.
And what was the finding, what was the verdict in that regard?
So that younger age category, the NEETs in South Africa, for that older age group, the rate is lower, but still 40.7%.
Our signal's not the best with Keegan. It seems to be failing. Let's move on to one of the other claims, or some of the other claims, Keegan, that are being made, and the UDM, as well as one that we thought we might look at this morning around South Africa's debt to GDP ratio at 73.6%. And that translates to roughly, well, almost 6 trillion, but probably around 5.8 trillion rand. What did you find out about that claim?
Well, this figure that they're using is correct, roughly. They're getting it from Treasury, which actually put it as 5.2 trillion rand. But the percentage that they used was accurate. The complicating factor here, which is why we rated this mostly correct instead of entirely correct, is what this implies for the country. So debt to GDP ratio doesn't have like a strict cutoff limit or a point at which it becomes an issue. In South Africa, a lot of experts have said that that 70% ratio is sort of an upper limit. But there are countries with much higher debt to GDP ratios. One famous example being Japan, which has a debt to GDP ratio of 200%. And so a country can be stable with a high debt to GDP ratio, and it involves a lot more external factors to judge what this says about the stability of a country.
Given the time, I'll do one more before we go to the question, Keegan, of why it is important to raise, some of the issues. Some might say, well, this is, not one that's going to really sway a voter or not. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But let's go to the MK party and speaking to a claim that really affects all South Africans. The ratio of one police officer for every 242 citizens in a population is alarmingly low. You found this to have been incorrect. And it was interesting reading what the final analysis was, that it actually turned out to be worse. But just walk us through what you discovered on that claim.
Absolutely. So the MK party has the ratio rather. Instead of one police officer for every 242 citizens, it is one police officer for every 334. So there's actually fewer police to population than they claimed. But again, there isn't a sort of specific ratio that we need to aim to achieve. Their comment about it being alarmingly low, that doesn't actually really come into play because experts have repeatedly told Africa Check it's not about the number of police officers that we have, it's about our strategy for combating crime and how we deploy police officers where we're using them.
I think what I found interesting, Keegan, in the way that Africa Check fact-checked all of these in providing the detail, but also helping the population to understand the definitions that are used. Because sometimes a figure can be correct, but the definition or the way that it is contextualized could be out of sync. You have compiled a compendium as Africa Check of different claims that you have looked at, some of those by public demand or questions that people have put to you or others that your research team has done, to share with our viewers very quickly where they can find and access the resource.
Absolutely. You can find us at africacheck.org. That's our website. But you can also find us on social media, where you can send us the claims that you would like us to fact check. We're on Twitter as Africa Check and on Facebook as well. You can even find us on WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp line that you can subscribe to. But if you go to africacheck.org, the latest thing you'll see there is our review of several of the opposition party manifestos. And hopefully there's lots of other resources there for people deciding how to vote this coming election.
All right. Thank you very much, Keegan. And to our viewers, things that make you go, you can go and have a look at what Africa Check has found out. And if you have a question, something you doubt, something you don't trust, put it to them and their team will be able to respond to that. So thanks again to you, Keegan Leech, researcher there at Africa Check. Ahead on the program, Deputy President Paul Mashatile leads a ceremony